Hey, I'm Logan. I'm talking about quantification for conlangers. And I think I want to start out with just a little bit of explanation of why you should listen to me and what you should expect out of this. So I've got a master's in computational linguistics. And the one thing that I remember most clearly from my formal semantics coursework is arguing with my professor about how in the world quantifiers work. And eventually he convinced me that the literature was correct. And I've been fascinated by it ever since. So quantification is a fairly large subject, and there's a lot of mathematics and logic that goes into it. And we are not going to be touching any more than the very surface level here. So I have tried to keep the mathematics and the logic content minimal, so it should be accessible to everybody. But just be aware that like every other slide in this presentation is backed by 20 or 40 pages of published linguistics papers. So this is just an introduction. Hopefully it will inspire some people to look deeper. First easy introduction to quantification is quantifiers. Quantifiers are words or constructions which specify how much of something you have. So every, most, some, all, a lot of, a group of, numerals, those are all fairly obvious quantifiers. Note that they span a bunch of different syntactic categories. Some quantifiers show up as determiners. Some quantifiers show up as adjectives. Some are, as I said, numerals. Some are compound phrases. Then we've got other quantifiers that maybe are not quite as obvious, like always or sometimes, which are adverbial. So they're quantifying things like time or events. But generally, quantifiers are a semantic category, which are not necessarily confined to a specific syntactic category, although they might be. In English, they are not. So here, this is going to be our one slide of actual mathematics. If you're familiar with formal logic, then you might have been introduced to quantifiers in the form of the universal quantifier, which is usually pronounced for all, and the existential quantifier, which is usually pronounced there exists. And in typical predicate logic semantics, those are conceived of as atomic operators that introduce a variable. But it turns out that's not really a good way to model natural language, because we have a lot more ways of talking about the amount of things than just saying at least one exists or let's talk about all of them. So if you look into set semantics, it turns out that we can decompose the semantics of quantifiers into several different elements that can be individually tweaked. And different quantifier constructions tweak different pieces of these compositional semantics. So the basic common components of all quantifier constructions on the semantic level are the basis set for all of the things that you could possibly be referring to. And then what a quantifier does is it takes that basis set and it gives you a new set of reference, which is some subset of the basis, with a particular restriction on its cardinality, which may or may not be dependent on what the actual original basis was. So for the traditional for all universal quantifier, you're creating a new set from whatever the basis is, with the restriction that the cardinality of the new set is equal to the cardinality of the basis set. That's what all of them means. And then for the existential quantifier, we're creating a new set that has at least one element in it. Its cardinality is 1 or bigger, which is a subset of the basis set. And then we can assert things about, that single element set. If all of that is horribly confusing, hopefully it will become clearer as we move on and look at some examples. Remember that I said the restriction on cardinality may or may not have anything to do with the size of the basis set. And that turns out to be a really fundamental distinction across different languages. So we have this categorization of weak quantifiers, which are quantifiers that don't care about what the size of the basis set is. And those are also sometimes called absolute quantifiers. So all numerals, for example, are weak or absolute quantifiers, because if I tell you, like, there are 6 chocolates left, which is example number 4 down here, it does not matter how many chocolates exist in the world. I am talking about exactly 6 of them. In contrast, strong quantifiers or proportional quantifiers make an assertion about the size of the quantified set as a proportion of the size of the basis set. And this has really significant syntactic implications. In particular, across different languages, weak quantifiers or absolute quantifiers are acceptable in existential contexts, whereas strong quantifiers are not. And that's not something that you could just derive from the logic. There is no particular reason why it shouldn't make sense to assert that all chocolates that exist do exist. But there's no easy way to say that in English. I had to resort to a weird circumlocution in order to do that. You can say there are some chocolates. You can say there are 6 chocolates, but you can't say there are all chocolates, or chinchillas, as I actually wrote on my slide. When you go and look at other languages, it's the same. In particular, in many North American languages, there are quantifiers that behave like verbs. So again, quantifiers are not necessarily restricted to any syntactic category. They can occur as pretty much any part of speech. But in, for example, Kwakwala and Statimchets, which are both Northwest Native American languages, you have verbal quantifiers, and when they are weak quantifiers, they can serve as the main verb of a sentence, and they have an existential meaning. But when it comes to strong quantifiers, they never have a clausal interpretation. They can only form an embedded phrase. So then we have, in addition to that semantic distinction, there is a very significant syntactic distinction in quantifiers, which are usually labeled D versus A. So D quantifiers stands for determiner quantifiers. And those are quantifiers that attach to clausal arguments, which usually means a noun phrase. So all, every, some, those are all D quantifiers in English. Meanwhile, A quantifiers, that stands for adverbial quantifiers, don't attach to a clause argument. They syntactically attach to verbs or whole clauses. And now you might think that syntax ought to reflect semantics. So a quantifier that attaches to a noun phrase should tell you something about the amount of the reference of that noun phrase. And the adverbial quantifiers that attach to a verb, it ought to tell you something about the event described by that verb. But it turns out that is not always the case. The syntactic structure of your quantifiers does not have to match their semantics. And so we can look at some examples of that. If you say, for example, I went skiing 4 times, That's a quantification. 4 times is a complex phrasal quantifier, which attaches at the clausal level, and it tells you about the event. So it's quantifying the referent of the verb. How many times did that event occur? If you say something like, I always look handsome, that's another example of a quantification, which is predictably quantifying something about the verb. In this case, it's not the event, it's about time. So there's some interaction of quantification with tense going on there. But then look at something like, humans always have brains. Is that the same thing as just saying all humans have brains? Maybe. At least as far as my personal grammatical judgments go, those are very similar sentences, but I could argue for some differences in interpretation. But then let's look at birds sometimes have blue coloring. I don't know many birds who regularly change their coloring, so the only possible interpretation for that, in my idiolect at least, is that it's equivalent to saying some birds have blue coloring. It's not about time, it's not about events. So we've got a quantification there, which attaches at the clausal level, but the semantic implication is that it's quantifying a noun. It's quantifying the referent of birds. So clearly we can have this disconnect between the syntactic and the semantic structure of quantifiers. And it turns out that in some other languages, there aren't even dequantifiers at all. Your only option is a quantifiers. So that's a thing that you can do. Additionally, it is this kind of ambiguity of reference in a quantification is not unique to English, even when dequantification is available. So if we look at some examples from Sandawe, which is a Eastern African language spoken in Tanzania, there is no plural marking on inanimate objects in Sandawe, but there is a plural marker on the verb. And it turns out that a quantification, that a quantifier, is ambiguous between specifying the grammatical number of the object and specifying pluractionality on the verb. It can do either or both at the same time. And you just have to figure out from context which is meant. And often it doesn't even matter. It could go either way, and the end result is pretty much the same. So looking at this first example here, I have erected pillars. That can just as well be read as a pluractional, meaning there were multiple instances of me erecting a pillar, or it can be read as just a regular plural object, where I erected things once, and the things that I erected were plural. The end result is the same, so nobody really worries about the ambiguity. Another important aspect of quantifiers is scope. So how do things that are quantified nest inside and get associated with other things that are quantified? English has this semantic feature called quantifier raising, where at the semantic level, quantifiers can end up being reordered, which creates a large degree of ambiguity. And English is not unique in this. Russian does the same thing, French does the same thing. Most languages that the audience right now has probably studied probably do the same thing. So if you take the example sentence, all the children read half the books, we'll suppose a background situation where there are 4 children and 4 books, just to make it easier to talk about concretely. And there are 2 different ways to read this, depending on how you order the quantifiers, all versus half. In one reading, all 4 children each separately read 2 books out of those 4 but they might not necessarily be the same two books between each child. But another possible way to read it is that there are two specific books, and every child read separately those same two books. But it turns out scope gets even weirder than that. There's a third possible reading, which is not easily available in English, but turns out to be the only possible reading in some other languages. So here we have another example from Statimchits, from the American Northwest. And Statimchits quantifiers behave very differently from English quantifiers. They do not actually scope over each other at all. So the only possible reading of this naive translation of all four children read half of the four books is a disjoint scope reading, where four children, all of the four children, participated in the act of reading, and exactly half of the books were read in total. So like they were all reading books together and maybe alternating pages or something, and between the four of them, they all read two books. That's really hard to express in English because we don't have that scoping relation, but it is another thing that you can do. And just as a bit of a teaser for a later slide, it turns out that languages that allow freer word order don't necessarily lack this ambiguity that English has. It's a really common ambiguity to have. But in English in particular, there's really no way to avoid it because our fixed word order requires that D determiners go in a particular order, regardless of what their semantic scoping is. So if we want to have multiple readings, it's just going to be ambiguous. English syntax doesn't allow it to be any other way. But now we get to one of my conlangs. So WSL has extremely free word order and very weird syntax in other ways. But as a result, it turns out that it is possible to make the semantic level ordering and scoping relations of WSL quantifiers exactly match the surface level syntax. So if we take an ambiguous sentence here, like everybody knows some people, there are two obvious quantifiers in there. Every, out of the compound everybody, is a universal quantifier, and then some is an existential quantifier. And then there's an implicit quantifier on the verb knows. There's no word there to tell you what the quantification is because it's just the default. We assume that there is exactly one event and it's not pluractional or anything weird like that. When we translate that into WSL, there are 6 different possible translations depending on the different ways that you order those 3 quantifiers and the noun phrases that are attached to them, which all end up with slightly different interpretations. So if we just go through all of these really quickly, the first one is kagitnu vesmekchus yestermekyo, which works out to putting an implicit existential quantifier on what gets translated from English as the verb, an explicit universal quantifier for everybody, and then a plural existential quantifier for some people. And in that order, you get the reading that everyone has some group of people that they know, and this is all done as one single collective psychological action somehow, which is potentially kind of a weird reading. And then as we go through all of the other different permutations, we get different readings depending on the scoping of the quantifiers. So another translation is everyone separately has some group of people that they individually know as a unit. or everyone has some people which do not form a natural unit, but they know each of those people separately, and so on and so forth. But now we're going to move on to another interesting place that quantification shows up. It turns out that the semantics of modals is most easily formalized in terms of quantification, specifically quantification over probability densities, which is a mathy word. So a more common way to phrase it is quantification over possible words or possible worlds. And again, different moods, when conceived of in this way, can be differentiated by what the quantificational base is, or the modal base, as it's usually referred to in the literature on moods specifically, where the most basic distinction is epistemic versus deontic. So is our base of quantification defined by the set of worlds that conform with what we know for epistemic moods, or by what we care about for deontic moods? And then we also have a basic distinction in how big the quantified set is, which gives us necessity versus possibility. Are we making assertions about the entirety of the basis set, or just about some element of the basis set? And it turns out that you can be ambiguous or not separately in each of these different domains. So in English, our modal verbs are ambiguous about the base, but they are clear about the quantification. So like modal verbs like may or might or should. If I say, you should get a pet dog, that has two different ambiguous meanings based on whether it's epistemic, like you should get a dog because I have determined from my knowledge of the world that it is probable that you will, versus you should get a pet dog because I think it would be a good idea. But in Statimchets, again, it turns out they slice up their modals in a totally different way. They're ambiguous about quantificational force, but they have separate modal verbs to be very explicit about the base. So the equivalent sentence in Statimchets doesn't distinguish between, for example, you should get a pet dog and you must get a pet dog, but it does distinguish between whether you should get a pet dog because I have logically concluded it versus you should get a pet dog because I think that's a good idea. And again, I intentionally played with that in WSL, so you can be clear or ambiguous about either one however you want. And so the way that modality works in WSL, rather than having unanalyzable individual modal verbs or modal particles, there is a compositional syntactic mechanism for individually specifying each of the components of the quantification. So you can invent entirely new grammatical moods as your mood pleases you. So here are several examples of different constructed moods in WSL, which translate to things that don't necessarily look like grammatical moods in English, but they are using exactly the same underlying semantic machinery. And it turns out that this gets really easily mixed up with notions of evidentiality, because while things like the epistemic versus the deontic mood are concerned with specifying a quantificational base based on what we know in general versus what we care about in general, evidentiality is essentially the same thing, just with restrictions on how we know the stuff that is relevant to the modal base. So if we just quickly speed through some of these examples, we can say things like, there could easily be a dog, by explicitly putting in an existential quantifier over the set of worlds that conform with what we know about reality, versus there must be a dog. We get that just by replacing the explicit existential quantifier with an explicit universal quantifier. We can also say things using the mechanism of grammatical mood, like, it is 80% certain that there is a dog. This das ist ut in that example it's basically just a numeric fraction, which tells you that we are quantifying a particular proportion of the set of all possible worlds to explicitly talk about a specific probability. You can also do things like throwing in an actual specific numeral. So this example, kashunu hing es, is kind of difficult to translate idiomatically into English, but it basically means I can think of 5 ways that a dog could exist that are consistent with what I know about the world. We can talk about logical implication through the mood mechanism, just by specifying that our modal base is restricted to a particular kind of world, and then saying that we're making some assertions about all of those particular kinds of worlds, and so on and so forth.
Sorry, Logan, I just want to give you a 3-minute warning. Well, it looks like you're setting up.
Yeah, it looks like I'm hitting my time. So good. So in summary, what can we quantify? Basically anything you can think of. We can quantify over objects, that's obvious, but we can quantify over events. So you get pluractionality and various ideas of tense and aspect. You can quantify over times. You can quantify over probabilities and worlds. How can you do it? You can put your quantifiers syntactically in adverbial positions or in adnominal positions or anywhere else you can think of. You can do it proportionally. You can do it absolutely. You can rearrange different scopes. And what can quantification do for us? More things than you can possibly imagine. Obviously, you can count things, but it interacts with tense, aspect, mood, and even evidentiality. And in fact, just this morning, Linguist Twitter informed me of a new way that quantification interacts with gender agreement in English pronouns. And the rules for that are actually currently changing. So it is soon going to be necessary to go and revise examples in old syntax textbooks. So there's just a world of depth here. And I hope I have convinced some other conlangers to go and research it and start making conscious decisions about how to use quantification in your languages.
Thank you so much, Logan. We've only spared about 1 or 2 minutes for questions. There's been a couple coming in YouTube. The first one was from Carl. Are there examples of languages that tend to express the majority of their quantifiers by one single part of speech rather than spreading them out against multiple parts of speech?
Maybe. So there's the literature is not particularly clear on that. If you look at the Salishan languages, of which Statimchets is one, there is some disagreement about whether or not Salishan languages even have nouns at all. Yeah. If they don't, then it is reasonable to conclude that all of their quantifiers are verbs. And so they are restricted to one part of speech, but that part of speech is not itself restricted to quantifiers. That's the most clear-cut example I know of. Okay. In most languages that I have studied, they're just spread out all over.
Just a very quick second question from A. Walker Scott. With your Stimchets, which I'm mispronouncing, example, what about all 4 children read half of each book, none of the books were accompanied by or completed by any of the children?
I don't have the data to say whether or not that would be a valid reading of Statimchits. I suspect not, but that is definitely a possible scoping relation that you could implement.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We